So, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker. Dr. Justin Pearce is an Associate Professor at Torrens University, Australia. Justin has a special interest in strategy, information systems, economics, education and malfeasance, with extensive relevant qualifications backed by extensive industry experience with Target Australia and the Cotton On Group. Look forward to hearing Justin discuss the ambidextrous organisation. Please welcome Justin.
Yeah, yeah. It looks a bit different to his photo.
I was going to say it's been probably 12 months since I've been here and seen many of you. I know many of you. I've met many of you. I've grown my hair and I've grown a beard since that time. Those of you who I don't know, hi, I'm Justin, and that I guess was a photo taken about, good heavens, maybe 8-9 years ago now. I was told earlier today that I now look like a lecturer, which is it's good, it's fine. So here, by the way, is another photo of me. This is what I'm about. I work here at Torrens, obviously, and you might know my colleague, Dr. Michael Rowe. We've been colleagues now for some time, and I do this because I love learning things, right? So I love being part of learning, whether that's my own. I mean, I always get a kick out of learning something new, but then also being involved in other people's learning as well. So that's what drives me. And just even in the classroom, you would have noticed the demographic of the student that we've got at Torrens as well. What we try to do, obviously, is set those people up so that they can be successful in their careers. I spoke to somebody the other day about trying to, the drive for industry and how we involve industry in the university is to get perspectives on making the students work ready. But we've realised that that's probably not what we ought to be doing. We don't want them ready to start on their first job. We want them career ready. And so that's why I say on the slide behind me that I'm more interested in developing those people's capabilities. And we've got a flavour here at Torrens about being for good. We're a B Corp, so that naturally aligns to what I'm on about here as well. So today I'm going to talk to you today about something that's not new. In fact, you'll find it if you wanted to. You'll find it in the April 2004 edition of Harvard Business Review. So it's not new. It's something that's been out there for quite some time. But I think it's important, and I think that you might get something out of it. Even if you know it before, if you've heard of this before, that's fantastic. Just if you could share your expertise, I guess, when we're having our discussion later. Just to introduce this, there was once upon a time a Roman god named Janus. And I don't know about you, but when I was a young tacker, I was told once, with my dad facing the other way, he said, "Justin, leave your sister alone." And I was puzzled. Well, how on earth did he know? He said he had eyes in the back of his head. Right? And of course, the god Janus does as well. And Janus is the god that January is named after. And it was said that he's got one set of eyes in the front of his head and one in the back. And so all of this was about the ability to look forward, but then also the ability to look back. Right? Obviously, we don't have that luxury as mere mortals. But what I'm about to talk about requires us to kind of have a similar ability. Right? So this is what I want to talk about today. We're in business here. We're part of a network where we try and support each other with that. You would know now, having started your own businesses, that it normally starts with a great idea, and you start it, and you get some success, and then following this, you expand your business, maybe into a new office. Maybe you get some people working for you, and it grows. And this is the idea. This is what we want for it to do. Hopefully one day we could sell it, or it's a rather large, successful enterprise, and that's what we're hoping for. Somewhere along the line, though, we're going to have to change, and that's either going to be driven by the requirements of our customers, or it's going to be driven by the business environment more broadly speaking. right? And so there's going to be a need at some point to innovate, and we're going to talk about why it's so hard, the types of innovation, and indeed why they're so pervasive in the current discourse, you might say, right? We've got a little tool there. It comes directly from the research that I'm going to be talking about. Before we go into the main takeout for today, which is, of course, the ambidextrous organisation. So we're going to show models of that. We're going to talk about what they do. We'll show you 2 examples. They're all older examples, but we're all ugly and old enough to remember at least what these are. How to become them, and then I'll break them for our discussion. Right. So first of all, I want to situate our innovation discussion now. I want to talk about why it's so bloody difficult before we discuss the types. And look, you may have read Clayton Christensen. You may have read the Roger. Good heavens, Michael. Roger.
I was going to answer Innovator's Dilemma for Clayton Christensen.
Yeah.
Roger.
I can't think now.
Roger Rogerson. Rogerson Hart. Is it a music?
Yeah, that. Obviously, it is a so-called flavour of the month, and you know there are lots of articles out there talking about it. If you're active on LinkedIn, you know, it's almost a currency, isn't it? So, but I want to talk about why it's so hard. And in some ways, this next slide here is a little cliche. In some ways, right? Because we're talking here about the brands that kind of bit the dust. Some of them are still around, but they've bit the dust for their inability to work with changes in the environment, right? Holden is one that makes me very sad. I still drive a Holden. I love a Holden, but they're no longer, of course, manufacturing here. Now, that was something that was brought to the Australian automotive industry way back in the 80s. It was in the Button car plan, and they were going to wind down the government support that the automotive industry was offering it, and it took another 30 years to finally say, no, we can't do this. We can't do this, right? There were drivers there to really innovate back then, but of course they didn't. There's a number of other examples there on the slide where you could argue that some of their competitors have taken over other, by putting out a more superior product, or embracing the changes in the environment as they felt. Right? And look, I would argue that it's so difficult mainly because we get into organisational inertia. Right? We start to believe our own successes, as it were. Indeed, you may have read Jim Collins. You may, if not, you may have heard of the book From Good to Great. Yeah, we have, right. And that is a book, of course, that talks about a sample of organisations that Jim Collins looked at, and he mapped the trajectory of some fantastic businesses that made it big. And has anybody heard of the follow-up book From Good to Great? Okay, so there's a follow-up group, and it's also by Jim Collins, and it's called How the Mighty Fall. And the funny thing is that is a book that catalogues many of the businesses that were in From Good to Great, and how they started then to believe their own hype and their own hubris, and they went tumbling back down again, right? And that's kind of why it's so difficult. Now I want to talk about the different types of innovation. It doesn't matter what product, what business, what area you're into. The first thing is that you've got some sort of product or service that you are offering to your clients, right? And the first type is where you make small incremental changes to your product, incremental innovation. Think about, many of us will remember what life was like before our toaster had a reheat button on it. Right? The numbers on the toaster, by the way, refer to minutes that it will be toasted for, right? But at one point, there was never a reheat button. There was never a toast from frozen, and there was, so these things had to be invented and innovated. And these are the little stepwise incremental things that I'm talking about. If it's not that, then it's putting cruise control on the cars or power windows on the cars, right? And those are little tweaks just to make it a little bit more desirable, I guess, from the client base, so that we can generate some interest in the business and its products. Right? So that's that one, incremental. The next one refers to what we're calling architectural innovation. Now, the diagram here is showing us that the solid line there is representing the environment, the business environment. As we all know, the business environment, the industry environment, the environment that we're operating in right now is in a state of flux. It's always within change, whether it's exchange rates or geographical, macroeconomic factors that are just making things difficult, right? And they do change. A recent example that would help illustrate this point in the industry, indeed in the university sector, that we have to deal with and we have to adjust to, right? So it's making these steps in line with the changes in the environment, is the issue of generative AI, right? So many of us are probably working in the space or having a play with ChatGPT. That's cool. And so you should, because it's representative of one of these rippling architectural changes, right? And so architectural innovation refers to that. We have to keep in step with the changes in the environment. The last one, the discontinuous innovation, and perhaps this is, the word I'm looking for is the most challenging. And this is because there comes along, on the diagram here we've got what we call two S-curves. An S-curve refers to the introduction here of a new technology. And at the start, it has a relatively slow pickup, but then it has a period of ferment, and then eventually it matures, right? Now, the classic example, and you might remember seeing Blockbuster right, on the slide there. The classic example is going from VHS, or videotapes, right? So it was Betamax and VHS in the beginning, and a period of ferment, and everybody eventually settled on VHS. And at this moment in time here, there was a disruption or a discontinuous innovation in that, and we were introduced then to DVDs, as you would recall, right? So where we've got something that comes along and displaces something else, it refers to discontinuous innovation, right? Now, as business people, the funny thing is we've got to keep our eyes on all three. Keep your mind back on Giannis, right, with two pairs of eyes. We've got to keep our eyes on all of these things because we've got improvements to the product. We've got to keep in step with what's happening in the business environment. And at any moment in time now, look out, because it all might be different and we might have to deal with a discontinuous change, or what you might have heard being a disruptive change. Okay? So we've got to deal with these things. Now, one of the ways that you might look at managing it is with an innovation map like this. So I've noticed a couple of people were taking photos of this. This comes from the article, by the way, O'Reilly and Tushman there. But effectively, you can write down what you're working on at the moment, okay, and whether they are aimed at new or existing customers, to see what activities you've got going on in your portfolio of projects and whether there are any gaps, right? So there's a potential for you there to see it at the helicopter level, at the high level, so that you can look out for that, all right? So moving on, that's at the high level, right? That's at the 10,000 foot view. But we're ignoring so far that we don't operate normally at the 10,000 foot view. We normally operate within our businesses, which means that we're on the floor, we're hands-on. That's the nature of it, that's the way that it goes. And so now I want to talk about, what are the structures that we've been using here? And so now I'm going to go through these four basic structures. The research that I'm referring to went through and mapped and measured the progress and the performance of a number of companies that were innovating, but that they adopted different structures. And the reason why we're talking eventually about the ambidextrous organisation is because that was the one that showed a 90% success rate. Okay, so let's have a look. The functional design. I've kept this relatively simple, right? The functional design is one where we have a manager, a general manager, and that there are functional roles, such as it says they're manufacturing, sales, and R&D, right? And so if we are working on some sort of change or innovation project, then these people have got to work with the project as well as what they do during the day, okay? So that is the so-called functional design, and you'd recognise that. Even if it's not in your business now, you would have worked for another one in the past that embodies that one. All right? Simple. This one is called the cross-functional teams, and it's added to the previous functional design just a little bit because we've added here an informal structure. So what we're saying is it operates and it has been established outside of the normal hierarchy, which means that some of this activity, right, you might say the manufacturing, sales and R&D people are still working on their day jobs. This is business as usual stuff, right? But then it could be, you might have heard what they do on a Friday at Google. You can do whatever you want, 20% of your time. And so that's what we're talking about in that emerging business area, right? But it is non-structured. It's outside of the established structure there, okay? That's the cross-functional one. We've then got another one which is called an unsupported team. An unsupported team is one that is again set up and it's outside both the structure and the hierarchy, and it does not, please note, involve people who are working from the day-to-day activities. So it's almost like out on its own and it's separate. Now, you might be thinking this is a good thing, you might be thinking it's a bad thing. How do you get your cross-pollination and how do you get that? We'll get to that in a second, right? Because the last one, this is the unsupported teams, right? This is just another version of the structure there. But the final one is the so-called ambidextrous organisation. When you hear the word ambidextrous, it might ring to you that you can do the same thing with both hands. In some ways, we're misappropriating the term ambidextrous because what we're saying is we're doing two different things with two hands, right? So instead, we're saying that it is a balancing act. Under the ambidextrous organisation, we have two teams, and the two teams are structured independently, all right? One of them, as it says there, is focusing on the existing business, and the other is focusing on the emerging business. If you recall the two S-curve diagrams, right, then you've got one way of operating in the technology of the day, and you've probably got another one emerging, right? If it's not that, then you've got the issues of generative AI and whatever else is pervading the business environment as it is, right? So, we've now, under the ambidextrous organisation, got it basically separated out. So, what we've got is separate processes, separate structures, separate cultures, but what happens here at the senior level, and this is why we're talking to you about it, because you're the people who then imagine that you have these two arms, okay? You're the people then who have got to kind of marry it together. So there is an integration that occurs later on, and that occurs at the more senior level, right? The research, and it was O'Reilly and Tushman, I said it's in the April 2004 edition of Harvard Business Review, and perhaps we'll follow up later on, perhaps I'll find the link if I could please be reminded of that, right? The research was measuring the commercial results of these innovations. They're also measuring against the performance of the existing businesses, right? So what we saw was in two dimensions, and we saw that the companies that were adopting the ambidextrous organisation, as I said a second ago, had 90% success rate, 90% more successful The others, or I'll call more traditional, right? They actually faced a decline. Okay. Now, it's easy for me to stand up here and pontificate about this is what we should do in business because you know, this is what someone says and it's a nice looking structure. At the end of the day, the ambidextrous organisation is going to cost us more, isn't it? So yes, we do need to invest in it a little bit more than usual, but out of these, we did see a significant improvement over that. What do they do is what I'm going to talk about next. I'm then going to talk about some examples and we'll finish it off with how you might become one, which is a bit of a mindset, and swap over then to discussion. I am watching the time as we go, Rob.
There's no stress.
I'll foreshadow with you that I'm about 8 to 10 minutes away. All right. So, what do they do? Well, if you've got these two teams, then we're fostering that cross-fertilisation among the units, as it says there. We're also preventing cross-contamination. What do we mean by that? Well, they're physically separate. They're physically separate, and you can, if you wanted to, isolate those two teams. But of course, you can also share things like talent and other resources and expertise, and maybe even customers. If you're doing customer-led design as part of your product development, then perhaps you can do that as well. Right? So there's the potential to do it. You have got the opportunity both to keep them separate and perhaps to integrate them as well if you want. Right? So we can, of course, shield them from the we can shield the existing business people from the distractions of what's new and shiny. Right? Got an example here of USA Today. And look, it's a 2004 article. So the examples from that is reasonably old, but we can still use them and we can still illustrate the use of the ambidextrous organisation. Now, USA Today, coming out of the late 90s, the dot-com bubble, right? And a growing list of people moving online to get their news content, okay? Declining newspaper readership. It's something that the AFR and the Age and so on is dealing with constantly now too. And the way that they operate now is probably thanks to USA Today, because to set it up, they had a new business unit. Now I thought this was interesting because it aligns back to some areas of entrepreneurship theory, indeed intrapreneurship theory, where we might spin off a business. Right? But to do so, we have to invest and we have to start off. And in this case, a new unit was set up to implement USA Today. It didn't go well, right? Because, and it didn't work out straight away, and it didn't work out because there was an us and them mentality inside the business. Okay? And it was, you know, how come they get to work on shiny new things? There was, I'm a journalist and I've got journalistic integrity and I'm not going to move my stuff online and that sort of thing. Eventually, after those voices were silenced, it led to the introduction of what we call a network strategy. And in 2004, that was a huge thing. It was a huge thing. But what it effectively meant was that we could use the same piece of news and distribute it across the print version of the newspaper and the online version of the newspaper. As you know now, the AFR, you know, every first Tuesday of the month when we find out if we'll be paying more for our mortgages, right? Yes, it's going to be printed tomorrow in tomorrow's newspaper, but you can get it online, right? The reason for that is because they are sharing their resources. They're sharing it now, and, if you like, with the new business and the existing business, we're able to integrate that. The other example I've got is Cybervision. Okay, Cybervision is, or still is, it's owned by, I think, Navaritas now, or whatever they're called. They competed with Johnson & Johnson, okay? And to be able to do that, they needed to focus on their incremental changes and their architectural changes. And so there was a bit of a crisis point within Cybervisions at one point, okay? And what they needed to do was launch a number of change projects to be able to deal with changes in the environment and to be able to compete with Johnson & Johnson. They're a huge international, multinational juggernaut, right? So to be able to do that, it's the same sort of story. A new autonomous unit was created to be able to work on these improvement projects. Yes, there was initial resistance among the business as usual people, and the executives of those companies needed to almost separate them out, right? Almost to say, like, you've got two, I don't know, fighting children or something, and if you separate them, then perhaps they can get along. And indeed, that's what we did, that's what they did inside of it. I've already said that there is a huge amount of investment required. It's almost like you need to have a business as usual department and a new business and a new business development department as well. Maybe it's what you consider you do, being the entrepreneur that you are, right? It's only going to work, or the ensuing integration is only going to work if you are an executive that is sensitive to a number of different contexts. Okay, so the business as usual stuff and what's emerging into the future, right? If you've got a number of senior people working with you as well, then they too need to adopt that mindset. The reason for that, even the reason, one of the reasons I think why the network such as it is such a fantastic idea is because we get to share these ideas and we get to think about and potentially imagine nuanced situations there. Even though it's going to be difficult to adjust to this type of thinking, it is perhaps, and it's only perhaps, it is perhaps what may lead to greater success in that. Obviously we need a vision, but before I close off, we need to say that the complacency out there is I guess what we call organisational inertia, and it's a powerful force, right? I'm bringing back in the example there of Kodak there. To implement this is not an easy thing. It's a mindset and it's marrying two things together. Most people can't do two things at once. Yanis, the eyes in the back and the front of the head, helping us to look at that. I'm done, but I wanted to just introduce the idea of the ambidextrous organisation to you. How does that sit? And
how about its application within the SME segment? Because I get it from a multinational perspective.
Yeah.
But, the concept of walking and chewing gum is not foreign to business owners here. From a resource perspective, how can we implement that? Maybe not in its entirety, but a hybrid or something. I don't know.
In some cases, this is where things like think tanks come into it. At a practical level, that's where it comes into it, right? There's, I guess, other ideas like contract R&D. We can do that as well, right? Greg, you're going to do some of it with a body.
Yep.
Is that true? Yeah. So, Greg's going to work with us.
Oh, so are we able to? That's a real life example, Greg. Are you able
Oh, okay. So,
Excellent.
Are you able to share that, or are you going to give away some of your ideas?
Did I make a boo-boo?
no. I'm just trying to fit into this context, but it's it's about partnerships, right? So have an idea. So I kind of want to ask a question before I give an answer. So to do that, so my question on this is: do you need an idea before you set up the new ambidextrous part of your business? Or is it too risky to set up an ambidextrous part of your business to get the idea? If you just have a gut feeling that something's missing?
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
I think so.
So that's, thanks for that. So for me though, my new idea is you can't resource it from within the business. So you have to go for partnerships.
Yeah.
And reaching out. So I've got an idea that requires talent. And talking to accessing that talent from the university, and then but that won't be enough. I need to also find other businesses to partner with that to innovate. Because my 2 cents worth on innovation, especially in technology, it actually takes 7 years. And most small businesses don't have 7 years worth of investment to tip into an innovation project.
True.
So so I've actually come to this partnership with that as a problem. That the idea is a problem. That innovation takes 7 years. How are we going to pull this off?
And are you going to work with the MBA students? Is that part of the plan?
Yeah, that's right. And work it out on an equity deal, an innovation equity deal, as opposed to put your hand in your pocket money deal. So is that enough? Is that much? So that's my idea. I'm following my nose here.
Great.
Well, the idea is I don't have an idea. The idea is it takes 7 years and no small business can fund it. So how do we do it?
We like playing with new ideas. We don't, we don't necessarily need to be paid. So, hey, Richard.
Just interested in getting everybody's thoughts. Apple is tinkering around the edges. Every iPhone is sort of slightly better. It's incremental. It's the Apple Watch is sort of carbon neutral now. It's an Apple Watch, okay, so we've got an iPad, so what, sort of thing. Is Apple in danger of being one of the companies that's up on the Netscape or the Kodak of the world? Maybe not now, but in a decade, if it continues on like that.
I think every firm is. I think every company is certainly in danger, and it's largely. At one point, Apple had 160 billion US in cash. It's like, what the hell are you going to do with that? So, in some way, if you've got that in cash, as you know, it's a lazy balance sheet. So, I think in some respects, I think everybody is.
I think you can turn the question around, because Kodak was the Apple of its time.
Yes.
In the 50s and 60s, Kodak was the glamour company. And no one could ever imagine it failing. And just one, while I got the floor, one thing, when we started this presentation, there was a list of companies that were all very well known. One of the things that was a real aha moment for me was that none of those companies were badly managed. There was no failure of leadership or management process. They had talented people making the very best decisions they could, but they weren't aware of the need for ambidextrousness. Ambidexterity, whatever the word is.
Dexterity.
So you become so entrenched in what you're doing, you define the game that you're playing, and you know the dynamics, and you're winning, and everything's great, and you just don't see the innovation that's going to put you out of business. And so I look at newspapers that way. I had a friend 20 years ago who was on the editorial staff of The Age. She was a leader writer for The Age. And I said to her, this is going back actually longer than that, late 1990s. I said, what are you making of this internet thing? And she's saying, well, we have the internet on one computer on one floor in the corner, but no one uses it because that's not journalism. And the internet is what killed their business. So, they were rivers of gold. There's always going to be people selling shit, so we're always going to sell classified advertising. Didn't see it coming. So that's why I think to answer the question of what do we do as SMEs is the first thing is we adopt an ambidextrous mindset that says, we have to have some sort of boundary scanning, some sort of sense making, and some sort of way of bringing those wacky, wild, 1 in a million chance ideas into our organisational structure and the way we strategise, so that we're not blindsided by them like everybody else will be.
Yeah. Sorry, there was one. Yeah.
I was just going to share some experience with Apple. I know a few people that have worked in Apple, and they operationalise this concept in a really unique way. You talk to people at Apple. If you meet someone, let's say you're travelling and you're in the airport, sitting next to someone on the plane, they work for Apple. Oh, you work for Apple, that's really interesting. You try and get any information out of them about Apple, zero. There is a culture at Apple that is unbelievable. They are so protective about their intellectual property. And it's not just between them and the outside world, it's between divisional units within the business. So that example where you showed, you're basically building a sidearm separate project team. There will be a group of people at Apple that are working on, let's say, the central processor unit. There'll be another group of people that are working on the interactive display. They both work at Cupertino, that big donut building in California. They take the same bus to work. They'll be on the bus. They'll be sitting next to each other. Oh yeah, how's your day? I can't talk about it. They do not talk to each other.
Militaristic.
There's this amazing culture within Apple where they protect those little business units that you're talking about, and that's what drives the innovation. Now, well, it protects their competitive positioning. The difference between Apple and Kodak is that actually what drives Apple is not the technology, it's a fundamental understanding of how the human brain works and how users use devices, whereas Kodak completely missed the boat on that, and they missed the boat that humans would be attracted to digital photography.
I'll just add an extension of that, particularly on that last point. Not only the understanding of how users interact with their products, but also how to articulate that. You know how you go to every store, you know, and there's always lots of people. Every single one of those young guys, girls, you know, making up, they do 40 or 45 minutes of sales training every day, every single day. Right, so it sort of turns what you've said in terms of that understanding and how to get it out there. It's almost irrelevant what the product is selling.
Yeah.
I would agree.
But there's also a thing where technology turns into sociology. So technology enables new behaviours.
That's
And if you
true.
focus on the technology, you stop there. If you focus on the sociology, what does this enable, customer needs, that sort of thing, then you can be a lot more successful.
Sorry guys,
Yeah, just two things. With Apple, something interesting they've done, and I agree, I've actually done a bit of work in there, and they are in their units, but what they're doing at the moment is they're incentivising certain units in the business. What if they overachieve, they get a half day off a month, but they have to work with someone in a different department on innovation. And it's going really well.
interesting.
So, and the other thing I wanted to say, I think Netflix is a really good example from going from, you know, a content creator to a
True.
distributor.
Yeah.
Would you say they're a good example of an ambidextrous?
I think demonstrably, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just that I haven't looked at them in the context of this beforehand.
Yeah,
But you're right, they were, you know,
they shifted.
they are who disrupted Blockbuster, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Greg.
Hey, my other questions are, so if we're not committed to whole hog with ambidextrity, am I wasting my time if I give people a day a week to do whatever they like? Like, is that that's just a waste of time type incremental stuff?
I don't know that it's something I could answer. I think it's something to be born around the room. That's a discussion question. As in, go, yeah.
I'm just thinking about how do you measure success in terms of
Like, say you've got 10 people, right?
Yeah.
Are you better off taking 2 of them out and create another business team to go and do something innovative, or do you give all 10 half a day off? You know, half a day to do whatever they like. You know, what's the? Because what I'm hearing from this is better to take 2 people and create a separate team.
But that depends on the contribution of the individual team members. If you've got 10 people in an organisation, chances are you've got 10 different skill sets, and you probably can't afford to lose 2 of those skill sets. I mean, we're in a very similar situation to that right now, where a leadership team of maybe 6 or 7 people, we're in the middle of phase 2 clinical trials, but at the same time we need to do exactly what you're talking about, which is develop a separate activity which is planning for commercial launch. And we're going through this process at the moment. I can't afford to take 2 people out and just give them that job. The way to do this is to create a separate meeting, perhaps in a separate location, paint it a different colour, create a different culture around that.
Well, yeah.
Force people to take their current day business hat off and put a different mindset on coming into that meeting. So I think the answer to your question for the small companies like us is that you've got to get creative in giving, you don't give the whole person away, but you give them some thinking space. You give them some time off to give them an opportunity to adopt a different mindset going into a different piece of work. And I'm kind of just working through the challenges of how to do that at the moment, actually.
Can I sorry, did I cut someone off?
No, finish.
So it very much reminds me of the example of Walt Disney. So Walt Disney used to have his innovators in a separate building, away, even in a separate lift well, from his accountants, his lawyers and his engineers.
That makes sense.
Because if the 2 mix, you'll never get anything done. And that's simply true, because of the very nature of your accountants, your lawyers and your engineers, They look for problems to solve. Your innovation needs to be not worrying about problems. So I think, yes, it's important to separate the two, but you really need to handpick your people.
Yeah.
Because if you put an accountant in there and expect him to be, and with this all due respect to accountants, but if you put an accountant or an engineer or a lawyer in there, you're going to get a very different
There's
response.
some very creative accountants.
Oh, I'm sure. So I just don't think it's as simple as duplicating.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's hard and fast. Sorry,
Brendan, yeah.
Sorry, Brendan, did
Brendan,
you jump
yeah.
in?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering in your business structure,
Yeah.
like you've, well, there were 3, all I saw was research and development.
Yeah.
What are they doing? Aren't they supposed to be doing this?
Yeah, probably true. You know, perhaps I should have chosen finance instead of R&D.
But that's what,
Yeah.
that's what my business would be about, would be having a research and development team that would be
Yeah,
doing that.
yeah.
And
Yes. That's probably a piece of proofreading that. Yeah.
But if you, I mean, what you can't do is you can't breed a horse until it becomes a car. Okay, so there's no such thing. So, but it's a mode of transport. So this is so what I'm trying to say. So what I'm trying to say is you can get better and better and better going down one angle, but it's not going to create any innovation. That's what I'm trying to say. So we measure cars in horsepower,
Yes.
but if we put four horses on, we've got a 4. It's two completely different technologies. So what I'm trying to say is that we can go down that way, and we can have an R&D department that's there. But how do you know that they're not just going down a rabbit hole?
Paradigm.
Until how do you get the paradigm shift happening actually in the R&D department? That's the hard bit.
It's true.
Yeah, I'm just interested about the observations about corporate culture and what you're saying about within Apple, right? There's a consistency, but there's a difference. And I'm just interested in people's views around the objective is almost to break the culture and create subcultures, is it not? I know there'll be some consistency, but I know the downsides to that, because a lot of successful corporates talk about the strength of their culture and their values and all the rest of the espouse it in terms of the consistency and how they live it every day. But part of what you put up there suggests to me you're actually trying to create a new culture, which at the end of the day it's probably the objective, isn't it? Because a lot of those companies become spin-offs out of original parents with a completely different mindset and an approach to doing business.
Did you mean for me or for?
Oh,
for
just
the group?
like, I mean, the paradox between a lot of common narrative in business around the strength of culture and consistent culture, but the nature of the business model you're talking about almost deliberately seeks to turn that completely on its head.
I think there'll be those central tenets, like those core pillars of what would describe those behaviours within the culture. But there will be, as you referred to, there's those subcultures that will be in some ways different and in some ways very, very different, but those core tenets will remain. And I think the Apple example is a good one. So say each of those individual R&D units, those product units have slight variations, and that's inherent in who's driving those functions and also the purpose as well. Like what is the purpose of this particular team? But what's sitting over the top in an umbrella is that core behaviour of lip zipped, keep your innovation to yourself. This is something that we do holistically across the company. So there'll be some sharings, and part of the challenge will be managing the offshoots of culture in a way that doesn't see them morphing into something totally separate and distinct from the parent culture. That makes sense. So that's the challenge.
You're organically creating that new culture.
Yeah, and you need to create an environment where there's inherently a little bit of risk and there'll be some room to play, and that creates that variability that sometimes is good and sometimes is bad. So that's the challenge.
And yet the seeds of a lot of business failures are, I know it's a completely different environment in M&A, you're buying a business with completely different cultures. And you saw that in banking and finance, when all the banks decided to buy life companies and insurance companies and wealth management companies. And they ended up having to tell some very unfortunate stories to the Banking Royal Commission about selling life policies to dead people.
are there any case studies or examples you can think of wherein these separate teams are sort of heading, trying to achieve the same objective, or
I'll chase them up.
or if they're chasing some pipe dreams?
I'll chase them up at the same time I'm chasing up the original.
I've got an example of that, if you're interested. So Seiko, Japanese company,
The watches.
watches,
Yeah.
they created King Seiko and Grand Seiko, and they set it up as a competition. The winner takes all.
But they're still growing the category.
And so it's unbelievable that they set up these two businesses, two manufacturing places against each other, and the powers that be will decide. And Grand Seiko won. So I don't know what happened to all the King Seiko people.
They went to fish out.
No, they're actually around still, but they actually brought them back. But it was an innovation of a competition, 5 years or something they had. Amazing amount of money. Can you imagine that?
And the reason I ask is
But
because
same goal, right?
the reason I ask is because consciously, it's, I'm being extremely, it sounds like an abstract, a good idea, but unconsciously somehow I've been doing this all along since last 5 years.
Right.
At one end I've been running a business solutions consulting company which pays the bills, and on the other hand I've been building a platform for financial markets. So unconsciously or consciously,
So one's going to do the other business out.
so therefore I was thinking maybe if there are any case studies or examples in which we can see whether these initiatives have been successful or not.
There's a cliche that comes to mind, and that is that the boss needs to get out of the business because they need to work on the business, right? And it sounds like you're doing that. So that, to me, is how you embody the ambidextrous thinking.
A good case study could be Mars. I spent 12 years there 17 years ago.
Oh, not the planet.
I know.
Yeah. But they've set up every product in confectionery, in their food and in their pet division as separate entities.
There you go.
So Bounty, Mars, Starburst, they've all got separate identities, avatars. And Starburst was where they play with the innovation that they brought into the pet side. So I only just thought of that.
There you
That
go.
could be a good one to look up. Mars Inc.
So, Steve Jobs was in his office, and also the story goes, and then the iPad was presented to Steve Jobs. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, I love it, but it needs to be a phone, and you're not going to touch that business until we've developed a phone from that. So basically the iPad came first, and then the phone came.
The tablet computer came in the late 90s.
But it was the iPad, he loved it, but he said, I really like it, but it needs to be a phone.
Yeah.
And stop work on the iPad, I'm on the phone.
Very good.
And that's how the iPhone came up.
Rob, at 3:30, thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.